So recently I asked you guys to let me know which character you'd like to see as the focus of the next character analysis video on the channel. And to find the answer, I uploaded a poll featuring 3 popular Sternritter characters, Äs Nödt, Bazby and Gremmy. And you know what interested me the most about that poll was actually how close the results were for the majority of it. At one point it could have honestly been won by any of the 3 of them. However, after 5,000 votes, and thank you so much to everyone who did vote in that, I really appreciate it, your winner was made pretty clear. And so in today's character analysis video, we're going to be taking a look at the creepiest Quincy, the Sternritter of Fear himself, Äs Nödt. And of course, for anyone who has watched any of my 1000 Year Blood War arc videos in the past, you'll know this is an outcome I am more than happy with, as Äs Nödt is easily one of my favourite Sternritter and honestly just a top tier Bleach villain, at least in terms of design anyway. And that design helped him have a real substantial impact on the 1000 Year Blood War, both in the story and on fans. And of course, speaking of which, there will be spoilers for Bleach's final arc in this video. But before we move on to the video in question, I just want to give a huge shout out to everyone who has come out for my recent Soul King video on the channel. It's done really well and it seems to have gone down really well with you guys too, so I just really appreciated that and just wanted to say thank you for your support there. But of course, if you haven't actually subscribed to my channel yet, now is the best time to do so. Click that button down below for weekly Bleach content, videos just like this one, and help keep pushing the channel towards that hopefully soon-ish subscriber milestone of 75,000. That would be completely unreal to reach. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up as well to show your support and also to help spread the word on YouTube, as likes really do help with the exposure. And if you want to take that support a little bit further as well, we do now have a Patreon on the channel too, where you can support me for as little as $1 a month. And I really just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has become a patron so far. Your support is really well and truly appreciated. So first things first, before we talk about Äs Nödt, I think it's interesting to look at the context of how he was introduced and the surroundings of where he was introduced into the story. Because when you look at the Sternritter, Kubo took a slightly different tact when it came to introducing them as he did with the Espada. When it came to the Espada and a lot of information in the Arrancar arc in general, Kubo took the approach of drip feeding it quite slowly throughout the arc, kind of giving us very little information about the majority of the Espada until we finally reached that Espada meeting chapter. But by that point, we were a good third of the way through the arc. With the Sternritter, it was a little different because there was quite an emphasis on them having these big, relentless rush attacks on Soul Society. The first invasion is just this crazy moment where we actually get introduced to quite a lot of Sternritter. Now, of course, it is relative because there are more Sternritter than there are Espada, but because we see so many of the Sternritter, you really had to have a great design to stand out from the rest. And I think, obviously, this is where Äs Nödt absolutely excels. His design is incredible in my opinion. It is a true testament to Kubo's designing capabilities that 490 odd chapters into the series he was still creating characters this iconic and this memorable. So Äs Nödt, along with a couple of other Quincy, really stood out as the tentpole examples of why the Vandenreich should be feared so early on. So in this character analysis video, we're going to be taking a look at Äs the same way we do every character, first looking at his personality and overall character design, moving on to his role in the story and his character overview, then finally his battles, his abilities, and his relationships if he has any. So starting then with his personality and design, and of course his design has to be the first real touch point, because I mean, just look at this guy. He looks phenomenal. As far as I'm concerned, he is totally a standout character in terms of design in Bleach. Instantly recognizable, whether you just see his eyes, you just see his frame or his creepy mask, there's so much about him that's totally unique. From the really long, creepy black hair to the black spiked mask to eventually the black spiked gloves, and of course those wide, ultra expressive but also kind of dead and creepy eyes, Äs just looks phenomenal and really embodies that idea of the fear. Now, of course, one big criticism of many of the Sternritter is that their entire character revolves around their shrift, And the same is true for Äs. That permeates both his design and his personality. His character's entire philosophy is fear. Äs doesn't have an awful lot of screen time in Bleach, and nearly every single line he utters is to do with fear, and this is both a good and a bad thing in my opinion. I appreciate the character's thematic consistency overall. I like that Kubo actually goes all in with the fear as well with this guy. There's no half measures where Äs Nödt is concerned. This character looks creepy, he looks stereotypical in the best kind of way. He really just looks like he's jumped out of a horror movie or something, which is exactly what I think Kubo was going for. But again, that's what I mean, it works really well. No one else in Bleach looks like this, and Äs really stands out from the crowd. As for his holy forms design, well, that's something we'll get into a little bit later, but needless to say, Kubo completely knocks it out of the park where that's concerned as well. Now, Äs's personality, on the other hand, is a little more interesting and a little bit more difficult to unpack. In my opinion, there are two very different Äs Nödts. There is the one in the first invasion and the one in the second invasion. Now, in my opinion, the first invasion was a testing ground for a lot of the Quincy. I think Kubo was testing the waters for the Quincy that he liked the look of the most, the Quincy he thought might be the most popular, and it's really interesting to kind of see the beta designs for some of these Quincy. BG9 looks almost totally different. His face looks more like an axe here, whereas later on it gets a slightly more squared look around the side. Bazby, when he jumps Yamamoto, is wearing a bog-standard Quincy uniform under his cloak. And Äs Nödt, while being perhaps more well-realised than some of them because of the prominent role he plays in the first invasion, his personality is nothing like it is in the second one. And it's actually quite fascinating. In the first invasion, he's mostly silent, he's quite stoic, but then even when he does speak, he's cold, calculating, callous. You know, he's all the C words, you know, he's calm, composed, all that sort of thing. He's just very much your sort of statuesque Terminator-style enemy who seems unstoppable, but doesn't really seem to have too much in the way of personality. In fact, I honestly envisioned him having a really deep voice when he spoke in that initial moment against Byakuya. However, when he arrives in the second invasion against Rukia, he seems to have taken on a totally different persona. More childlike, more impish. Now he's like giddy and laughing all the time, talking to himself, talking in very strange ways, just saying things like, I'm so lonely, where's my Senbon Sakura? Like, in just really weird ways. You can kind of imagine him almost bouncing around like a jack-in-the-box or something when he talks. He's laughing a lot, kind of cackling to himself, which he did absolutely none of in the first invasion. So there's two, in my opinion, very different characters here, but luckily they do actually coalesce, in my opinion, to make one pretty consistent character overall. The first invasion tonally is very different to the second anyway, it's just way more serious, and I think Äs fit the bill there perfectly fine, because you have to understand he was the poster child for the fandom, right? Characters like Äs Nödt, characters like Kurgeopi, of course Yuhalbach, but as far as the Sturmritter were concerned, Äs was a leading member of the Sturmritter in that early section of the Thousand Year Blood War, and fans were latching on to him as well. So it kind of makes sense for Kubo to think, okay, this guy, I like the look of him, he seems popular, we're going to keep him around, but I'm actually going to get a chance to really flesh out what he's like in the second invasion. So for me, it worked out fine. So looking at Äs's role in the story overall, and it's not particularly extensive. Äs's first appearance is chapter 494, and then his last appearance is chapter 570, so his manga lifespan isn't that long, and he also doesn't really appear in that many chapters in between those. I think I calculated it as he only has 14 separate chapter appearances, which really isn't a lot. But of course, he is only a supporting villain at the end of the day. That being said, of all the Sturmritter, Äs is treated pretty well by Kubo, all things considered. He gets a volume cover and he gets some semblance of a backstory. But as I said, Äs's first appearance comes in chapter 494, the closing chapter part 1, a really exciting chapter overall where the Sturmritter launch their first major assault on Soul Society. And Äs is one of 6 initial Sturmritters shown alongside Hashwolf appearing from Pillars of Blue Flame. And it's difficult to gauge much about this guy. He doesn't say a word for ages, but he does have some really cool moments. Each Sternritter is kind of sent off to a different division, and Äs gets Squad 6, where he ends up taking out a number of their foot soldiers. You see this great imagery of him like stalking them, walking forwards really slowly, casting a massive shadow, a ring of reishi thorns around him, impaling some Shinigami who are just hanging from them by their heads. Kubo, obviously, as we all know, massively playing up the gore in the Thousand Year Blood War, and it really works to create this ominous atmosphere for Äs Nödt. Now, of course, one interesting thing about Äs is that actually his epithet is never properly introduced in the series, despite the fact he is such a major Quincy. He's only ever referred to as F in the actual manga itself, although it's pretty obvious what his power actually is, unlike someone like BG9 or Robert Akutrone, considering all he ever talks about is fear. But of course, also Kubo would write the fear in one of the chapter volume sketches, so we do actually get that confirmation. But like I said, with Äs Nödt, it's pretty obvious. But anyway, Äs leads the assault on the 6th Division, and one cool little detail about this is the blonde Shinigami who basically tries to stand up against him and tells his comrades, you know, don't run, you're supposed to lay down your lives for the Seireitei, is actually the same nameless Shinigami that tries to stop Renji when Renji kind of pushes past him in the Soul Society arc to try and get to Rukia. It's consistency like that really made this first invasion have more punch, really made it more impactful, seeing Shinigami that even if we only slightly recognize them, that tertiary acknowledgement really helped make it feel more real. But anyway, Renji comes in and saves the day, bringing Zabimaru down between the two of them and saying that he'll take over from here. And you get this great panel of Äs. He's kind of looking up at Renji, but you can't quite see it. Kubo masterfully creating that air of creepiness with this guy, making him seem really eerie. And it just works really well. Now, of course, coming up against the 6th Division would normally have spelled certain doom for a villain. Byakuya and Renji are major characters, they're both fan favourites, and Byakuya especially is the poster boy for the Soul Society for being the ultimate Shinigami, the ultimate all-rounder who wins nearly every single one of his fights, the model Shinigami that people are supposed to look up to. And I think that's probably why Kubo chose Byakuya for this moment. But anyway, Äs and Renji square off a little bit. Äs uses Blute Vein to block Renji's Zabimaru, but then Renji gets blindsided by another Sternritter, Mask Damasclin, at which point Byakuya arrives to save him. Byakuya quickly takes control of the situation, and Renji says, I can't damage this guy with my Zanpakuto, but Byakuya sends Senbon Sakura towards Äs. Bear in mind, Äs still hasn't said a single word yet at this point, but it's quite interesting because he lifts his hand up. I don't quite know what his plan was here, whether he just wanted to see if Senbon Sakura would hit him or not, I don't know. But it does hit him, it slices through his hand a lot, and you see him just kind of like looking, kind of a mix of horror, but I'm also assuming curiosity as well. His eye just widens at the sight of all this blood running down his hand. Mask is like, why on earth did you just do that? Why did you let him cut through your Blute Vein? But you kind of have to wonder what's going through Äs's mind at this point, because obviously they've come prepared to steal the Shinigami's Bankai. That's their main strategy. So he's probably thinking like, oh wow, this is the Bankai, you know, this Zanpakuto is the Bankai I'm about to receive. That's really quite exciting to me. But Byakuya quickly takes control of the situation, sends Master Masculine, falling multiple stories down, and now it's just them versus Äs. And the Shinigami enact their plan, they release Bankai, expect to have it sealed, but of course the Quincy actually steal it. And Äs once again is the poster child for the Bankai stealing moment. He is the main one we see activate it. He brings his bloodied hand up, holding the Quincy medallion. This strange alien-like black Reiatsu lightning comes out, grabs the Bankai and draws it into the medallion. And to Byakuya's horror, he realizes that the Bankai has actually been stolen from him. And at this point, people were still a little unsure about the Sternritter. We'd only seen them for about 2-3 chapters max at this point. And yet this moment for Äs really kind of sealed him as an early fan favourite. Because like I said, he hadn't really had any personality yet, rather than just looking kind of creepy. But as he brings the medallion to his face, he kind of gives off this really gleeful grin. You can't see his face, obviously, but from his eyes you can tell he is just smirking at Byakuya big time. This proper, like, trolly grin, like, I've got your Bankai now. And people loved it. I loved it. It was such a great moment. He doesn't say anything, but it's just really cool to see. And it carries over to the next chapter as well, when you see that the rest of the captains who used Bankai have had them stolen. So the Quincy have succeeded in their plan, but we don't actually get to see Äs again for a couple of chapters as it moves back to Waco Mundo. But then moving back to Soul Society, and the fight continues, and Äs manages to strike Byakuya with one of his reishi thorns. And so begins one of these, to this day, most shocking sequences in all of the Bleach manga, where people weekly just could not believe what was going on. To the point where people were questioning it, and then some of those questions would actually turn out to be true, that Byakuya actually hadn't died. But regardless, Byakuya begins to tense up. Something strange is happening to him. He's been hit by this thorn, but it's something weird. He thinks at first it might be a kind of poison. And finally Äs talks, and he says, you know, can you feel it? Do you know what's happening? You probably don't, because this is something you have left long behind, Captain. You're feeling fear. And he kind of comments and compliments Byakuya on the fact that he is staving off the fear for as long as he is, because most Shinigami will scream and their hearts just basically inflame and burst from the fear they are feeling. That's how Äs kills people. But Byakuya is sort of holding this off, and he tries to strike at Äs, but Äs blocks it with the Bloop Vein again, and says that, you know, your mind has already been encompassed by my fear, engulfed by my fear. I'm now in control of this fight. And yeah, I don't think people could quite believe what they were reading. They were expecting some kind of Kubo trick and troll, I think, but it didn't really come. Byakuya tries to maintain his composure, but he sees this vision of Rukia turn into a fully gruesome corpse before his eyes, and he just stops, like terrified at the sight he's seeing. Äs Nödt comes in, punches him through the gut, basically. Blood comes out behind Byakuya, and Äs is like, you know, your legs have just stopped. And Byakuya tries to move away, tries to attack him again, but Äs basically goes on this spiel essentially about how fear is primal. Primal fear is an instinct, and we cannot ignore our instincts. And Byakuya sees himself covered in bugs crawling up his face, and he just screams, tries to attack Äs, but Äs uses his own Bankai now to decimate him. Rising up above Byakuya, he just summons Senbon Zakura Kageyoshi, and Byakuya falls to his knees. Chapter 502, which I believe eventually got the title of Falling Sakura or something like that. It was untitled when it first came out, which was kind of weird. It's a mind-blowing chapter even to today. Even knowing what actually happens to Byakuya in the end, I still can't forget the way I felt when I first read it. And so Byakuya crumples to the floor, but he's not defeated yet, and Renji jumps in as well to try and support him, attacking Äs, saying, you can't use the Captain's Bankai, how dare you? Äs Nödt uses the Bankai, however, to deflect Renji's attack. Byakuya gets back on his feet, and instantly Äs Nödt turns his attention back to the captain. And again, it's so alien seeing the Bankai being used in this way, used by someone who's not Byakuya in the canon manga. But Äs Nödt just ruthlessly pummels him with his own Bankai. And it's still crazy to go back and see that Kubo even went this far. Byakuya just gets shredded, then he gets shredded again, his pupils are gone, his eyes look lifeless. Renji is pleading with Äs to stop. He's like, stop. And he shouts like, you have to stop, and he tries to use Bankai. Master Masculine comes out of nowhere, rips Zabimaru in two, kicks Renji halfway across the Seirei. It's a moment that stays with me, and I still love it to this day. And I feel like maybe that's controversial to say, but I think... And it's so weird, because Äs Nödt and Master Masculine just turn out to be mid-tier Sternritters, basically, for the most part. And yet this moment is such a crushing defeat of just the normal Shinigami complacency, that normal Shinigami power that can brute force their way through every fight so far, they've just been torn to shreds. Byakuya has been pushed about 5 layers deep into the stone wall, more blood on the outside than in. His rib cage is showing, like Kubo is really pushing that gore factor. As scolds Master Masculine for attacking Renji, saying, you know, we could have stolen his Bankai, and Mask is like, oh, well, I thought only captains could use Bankai, as he casually tosses the remains of Zabimaru away. And Az just basically says, you know, you need to go back home and reread the datum that His Majesty gave us. And it's a real shame, in my opinion, that this is the only time that Az actually interacts with another Sternritter. Considering how outwardly strange he is and how creepy he must be and what a vibe he must give off, I'd really like to see him interacting with people of his own kind, see how they kind of approach him, how they kind of handle him. Maybe he's like really friendly with everyone in the Sternritter, but I kind of doubt it somehow. I suspect the reason you don't see him really interact is because he mostly spends his time alone. But again, it's impossible to tell because we don't see it. So Az has won a resounding victory here against Byakuya in one of the series' greatest upsets. It's a crazy, crazy moment, actually seeing a villain with this ruthless, bloodthirsty streak. The majority of Bleach villains so far have been lackluster in that area. You know, the Arrancar, the Espada, they're awesome, but they don't follow through. Äs Nödt actually just desecrates Byakuya. Of course, Byakuya survives this because Äs Nödt apparently doesn't finish him off either. But for those of us reading it weekly, it was still a level of brutality and efficiency from villains that we just hadn't seen before. Whether or not Byakuya should have survived is not really a topic for this video. I've done that video. If you want to check that one out, you can. But as for Äs Nödt himself, we only see him one more time in the first invasion when he jumps Yamamoto. And I have to be honest, I didn't like this when I read it. I couldn't believe that Kubo might have just killed off the best Sternritter at this point in the story, just like that. You know, Bazby, Nana, Nanajacoup, and Äs Nödt all attempt to blindside Yamamoto when he challenges Yhwach, and Yamamoto just predictably incinerates them in a single hit. You even see Az collapse to the ground. I think the reason Kubo did this is because he expected backlash for the Byakuya situation. It's not the first time he's attempted to offset that moment. Basically, the moment after you find out that Byakuya is dead, Kenpachi shows up with 3 dead Sternritter on his back. That's clearly Kubo being like, you know, guys, it's not all bad. And then later on, he has Az burnt to a crisp as well. So I think that was supposed to be a bit of retribution for Byakuya fans. Luckily, Az does actually survive this. There was a long period of time where I was really concerned that he was actually dead already. But no, he does survive. But unfortunately, we don't actually see any of the Sternritter for a long time after the first invasion. The next time we see the Sternritter is chapter 543, Letters, which is essentially their version of the Espada table meeting. And when we find out about Uryu becoming the new heir, we actually get to see a lot of their reactions, and Az is there looking shocked and pretty unhappy about this. And this was the confirmation he was still alive, and I was so happy about this. If you see my weekly review of chapter 543, I actually put in the title, Äs Nödt's alive, because I was so happy about it. But yeah, that's the only time we get to see him in that chapter as well. So, unfortunately, like I said, he's quite an impactful Sternritter, but you don't get to see much of him. He only really appears in that one instance in the first invasion and one instance in the second, with very minimal interaction in between. When Kisuke helps the captains retrieve their Bankai, there's a single shot of Az looking up into the sky, noticing Senbon Zakura's Reiatsu is leaving him, essentially. It's a cool shot, but it's all we get. And then Rukia and Renji arrive. Now, after Renji took on Masked Masculine, I think most people guessed that Rukia was going to be going up against Az, and this was a matchup people were really happy with overall, I think. I know I was. I was really excited to see Rukia hopefully avenge her brother. Obviously, we knew at this point he was still alive, but regardless, the feeling was mostly still there. And it was really cool to see the little sister now taking on the same creepy monster that decimated her brother. I'm not going to go into super in-depth detail about this fight because I've already done an entire video on that battle, Rukia versus Äs, but suffice it to say, when I was reading it weekly, I was all over the place with this battle because I thought Äs Nödt was being treated really weirdly, first of all. Kubo kind of contextualizes the fear a little bit, makes it a little bit weaker in many ways by fleshing it out. Now, whenever one of Äs's thorns hits something, it gives off this black ooze that it never did before, but that makes it seemingly easier to avoid. But also, I never liked Rukia's explanation for how she was able to circumvent it. I thought it was kind of rubbish that she could kill her body, but she's already dead. But, you know, it didn't really, it never made sense to me back then. I kind of wish Kubo had just said that she had covered her body in ice, as simple as that. Now it can't actually penetrate the skin, but he did something about her killing her nerves or something. So that fight was kind of all over the place for me. Ás's holy form, however, when he breaks out of Rukia's Sub-Zero, was a sight to behold. Many Quincy don't get fancy holy forms, and the disparity between who gets what kind of Volstendig is all over the place. But Tartar 4-As, the fear of God, looks pretty sublime. I think it's a full-on transformation. His eyes always had a tendency to roll upwards, but now they've gone so far they've started to bleed. Also, when he actually frees himself from the ice, we get to see that he's missing his lips, which is creepy. That's cool. That's why he's wearing the mask, I guess. It's actually quite understated. I thought Kubo might do a bit more body horror with that, or maybe there would be nothing wrong with him at all. But missing his lips, that's actually pretty creepy. That's a pretty creepy visual. Before we knew what was under the mask, I actually envisioned it as him having his mouth stitched together. Although I don't know how he would have spoken, but I guess it's not really important. But that's what I was envisioning. But actually, no lips was pretty creepy as well. And when he transforms, he's just like this demonic hell spawn with these twisted barbed wire rose thorn wings, this thorny halo. His body is like a skin sack that's stitched down the middle. He just looks fantastic. I have to say, he looks so good, and I cannot wait to see it again in the anime. Like, I think it's going to be off the charts cool. And he looks great. And the fight with Rukia continues, and the fear kind of becomes a little overpowered here now. This is what I mean by this fight being, like, just kind of all over the place. The fight is extraordinarily popular, though, I think. I'm pretty sure it's the second most popular Shinigami fight in Japan, as of the most recent poll, I believe, which is crazy. I'm guessing that's because it's got Rukia's Bankai in it. But I like to take that as a reflection on Äs as a worthy enemy as well. But yeah, so he basically reveals that now whenever Rukia looks at him, she'll be affected by the fear, and there's basically nothing she can do about it. The imagery of the fear is not quite as good in this fight. I guess it's a bit of a trade-off, like we get the amazing holy form, but actually the fear itself is a bit not so great. You just get to see some old panels in Rukia's memories, but now everyone's eyes are replaced by these dead black eyes, which is actually, again, pretty cool to be fair, but it's not a patch on corpse Rukia or, you know, bug-covered Byakuya, for instance, from the first invasion. But as Nödt creates this veil of eyes surrounding Rukia, Byakuya arrives to help save the day. And we get a lovely little addition to Ás's personality here, where he kind of says to Byakuya, "Oh, you know, I've been really waiting for you to arrive. You're looking a bit trim. Are you having trouble keeping your food down, perhaps? You know, I did take out a lot of your stomach, so that would be understandable." And it's like so sassy. It kind of comes out of nowhere as well, but he has this just really twisted sense of humor about him. And it's cool because he's been waiting for Byakuya this entire time. You know, the whole reason he challenges Rukia, you get this amazing moment at the start of their fight where she feels his Reiatsu. She senses him, but it's visualized by this creepy hand, like, coming out of the darkness and touching her. And she's like, what the hell was that? But there's obviously he's not there. That's done really well, but Äs is, the whole time, he's like, where's my Senbon Sakura? You know, how do I get Byakuya back? If I kill you, will he come to the battlefield? And Rukia's like, maybe, which is a pretty great answer. But I will say that throughout this whole battle, Kubo's art for Äs Nödt is always phenomenal. The character's eyes are constantly expressive, whether they're rolling upside down to reveal a Quincy cross, whether they're turning into like these crescent moons as he goes crazy about attacking Rukia, whether he kind of looks almost religious-like as he stands there with his arms out and the light of ring of thorns forming around him. I do think he looks really great throughout this whole battle. Kubo is really making the most of this awesome character design. But going back to the fight, Byakuya kind of counters Äs's sarcastic comments by basically saying, well, I really appreciate you stealing my Bankai because the fact that you did allowed me to really kind of reassess my relationship with it and become more powerful than ever before, is effectively what he says. And Äs Nödt doesn't take this well. And it's a little bit weird. This is honestly where the character gets a bit jarring for me. It felt like Kubo realised he was coming to the end of volume 63 in terms of chapter count and was like, I need to kind of kill this guy now. So he has Äs Nödt just absolutely fly off the handle for like very little provocation. As is just like, I will not kill you, I will not kill you, I'll let you experience the torment of life and death, between life and death instead. Like just going crazy, like repeating I will not kill you 10, 15 times. And unfortunately, Master Masculine before him, but Äs Nödt now as well, are examples of the Quincy in particular just completely losing their mind over what seems like the slightest little provocation. And it was a bit of a shame to see, but again, the visuals were top-notch. The stitches all burst open. This massive Äs Nödt head comes out of Äs's body and like replaces Äs, turns into this massive twisted monstrosity. The old Äs Nödt is now this like mask of skin hanging down from his chin. You know, Kubo just totally going AWOL with the design, but in the best way possible. Like, he still looks phenomenally good. But, of course, as we know, Rukia activates her Bankai and kills him in a single blow. The massive new Äs is just completely frozen straight to the core, and the top of his head is cut off, and he dies. On reflection, I actually don't mind the fight at all. In some ways, I actually quite like it. Now that I'm not quite so annoyed, I'm able to look at it with a slightly clearer mind rather than when I was reading it weekly, and yeah, I don't actually mind the fight at all. I quite like it. Perhaps the most interesting thing for me, though, outside of Rukia's Bankai, of course, is that Äs Nödt, randomly, is a Sternritter that gets a backstory, as small as it is, but I'm really appreciative of it, because not many Sternritter get backstories. But Äs's is pretty cool, so you see him at some indeterminate amount of time in the past, but it looks to be relatively modern, I think. He is lying in this hospital bed, he's got a respirator on, again, really cool that he has a mask on his face even here in the past. But you can actually see his mouth. It looks like his lips are intact here. And he's just lying there pretty much catatonic, I think. He doesn't seem to be able to move or anything like that. And he's basically just thinking to himself, like, I'm in so much pain here. I'm not dead yet, but even breathing is painful. And you see a German Bible next to him as well, which is a really awesome character trait. The Quincy's have long been associated with religion, specifically Christianity, for a while now, and it's cool to actually see one of them is a believer in Christianity. And as even says in his inner monologue, you know, when I die, you know, I feel like I'm going to die soon, and when I die, am I going to go to heaven or am I going to go to hell? You know, and I've heard that hell is this horrible place, and I'm terrified of going there, and, you know, will I go there? I hope not. I hope I go to heaven. And he's just clearly terrified all the time, living in this state of perpetual fear. He's afraid of the potential afterlife. He's afraid of dying. He's afraid of the state of life he's in. It's great because the book is next to him, clearly you would assume providing some kind of comfort, but at the same time providing this proverbial fear for him. But as he's lying there destitute, someone steps in through the door, and it's Yhwach. And I kind of like the idea of Yhwach visiting a modern-day hospital, coming in through the window like some weird Peter Pan character. It's quite a funny visual, but he basically stands at the foot of Az's bed and he's like, oh, so you're one of the survivors. Okay, well, I will bestow immeasurable power upon you. Unfortunately, it's pretty vague. We have no idea what Az survived, why Yuha Bark found him, how he found him. I guess he knew he was there because he had Quincy blood, but Yuha also looks pretty old here, so this must be pretty recent Yuha Bark. My assumption, and I think it's probably the same as most people's assumption, is that this is very recent. This is probably around the time Masaki died. So what was that, like, 10, 15 years before the present timeline? We know that Yuha used Aljvalen to basically drain the powers of every mixed blood Quincy he possibly could to help bring himself back to full power. And is it a possibility that Az was a gemished Quincy and that it nearly killed him to have his powers drained from him like that, but Yuha decided to, you survived, I'll give you strength? The only thing that I don't really buy about that is, like, why... Because Yuha clearly sees these mixed blood Quincy as lesser beings, so would he really allow one into the Sternritter like that just because it survived? And it looks like he's about to die, and we know that Katagiri survived for a little while as well, so why didn't Yuha seek her out? Or perhaps he did. Unfortunately, we don't really know, but regardless, Az seems to have accepted this offer, this deal with the devil, which is also a really cool little thing. Az has the Bible beside him. He thinks all about heaven and hell all the time, but he accepts this deal with the devil because he's afraid of dying. But ironically, the acts he commits as a Sternritter, the way he has become this twisted individual, would imply, if he believes it as such, that he would end up in hell anyway when he dies. And he dies terrified. Like, he dies, his head is cut in half, but the last thing he thinks is, I'm afraid. Clearly thinking back to that moment where he first met Yuha Bark. And it's just so great. You see the extra amount of detail we can go into because we actually find out a tiny bit of Äs Nödt's history. And that's just so refreshing to me. I love being able to talk about that. And it's such a shame many of the Sternritter didn't get that. Don't really know why Az did. I think Kubo just really liked this character. That's the only thing I can think of. Like I said, volume cover, actually 2 fights, and a backstory. He's pretty well-rounded for a supporting villain. I think Kubo probably just liked him a lot. In many ways, after we see his backstory and we understand his motivations for serving Yuha Bark, Az is something of a tragic character, constantly afflicted by this state of fear. He was afraid he was about to die, but even then he was terrified of going to hell. But when he accepted this deal with Yuha Bark, from that point on he was terrified of His Majesty killing him, essentially. That's what he says. He says, the only thing I'm afraid of now is having my existence just taken away from me by His Majesty. So he goes from one perpetual state of fear to the next. And it's actually kind of fascinating that Byakuya is kind of able to verbalise this for us during the finale of their battle when he says to Rukia, the only thing you are looking at now is his own fear, visualised on his body, as Az has become this twisted monster, kind of trying to project his own fear onto other people, but truth be told, he was the one who was terrified all the time in the end. And so I think that Az, while not a perfect character, not given anywhere near enough time to truly shine, is a really cool villain, supporting villain at the end of the day, and definitely one of the better of the Sternritter. And so that really about does it for his character overview, and we've talked about his battles and his abilities already, so if we look now at his relationships, and unfortunately, as a Sternritter, he doesn't really have many of them, and a mid-tier Sternritter at that as well. His main relationship would have to be that with his master, Yuha Bark, and we know he is absolutely terrified of this guy all the time, despite Yuha giving him the almighty power of a Sternritter, making him a captain-level fight from this feeble, broken and bedridden soul. But we can only imagine Yuha is the one who put him there in the first place. He might not have been, of course, it might have been something completely unrelated, but it seems to fit the timeline based on how Yuha looks and stuff. But yeah, Az is this small person in comparison to His Majesty, terrified of letting him down and being killed despite being afraid of hell as well. So it's a great relationship, and obviously there is the kind of Christian angle. Yuha is seen as a god by many people in this series, much like the Soul King, he is one of the closest things to an actual god. So Äs has gone from almost conventional Christianity with the German Bible next to him to worshipping this actual Bleach god, and being just terrified of him as well. So yeah, it's a pretty twisted existence for Äs Nödt. And it's also really cool that he seems to actually be German as well. I'm pretty sure the Bible is spelt Bibel, which I believe, that's probably terrible pronunciation, but I think that is German. And his name appears to be German as well. So that's pretty cool. The Quincy have a German motif. It's cool to see some of them actually are German as well. And yeah, that's Áz's main relationship. He has a semi-relationship with the Byakuya and the Kuchikis in general, but it's not exactly a relationship. There's an interesting thing going on with Äs kind of craving Senbonzakura after losing it, and that goes back to that idea I said of him looking down at his hand in like kind of awe at Senbonzakura and deciding from that moment on that he, you know, wanted it to be his. And he even says to Rukia, like, oh, you know, and Byakuya, oh, how I wish that Bankai was still mine, in this really creepy way. And it's just really kind of cool to see him, like, develop this attachment, this kind of horrific attachment to Senbonzakura, because Äs is really the one you see the most of regarding actually using the stolen Bankai. Kangdu does it a little bit as well, but that's kind of it, really. So yeah, unfortunately, Äs Nödt doesn't really have too many relationships, and that is the character in a nutshell. Sturmiter F, the Fear Äs Nödt. I feel like I've talked a ton about a character who doesn't really appear that much, but he is one of my favourite Sturmiters, so I was always going to have a lot to say about this guy. But I do find him to be really, truly interesting with a just genuinely brilliant design. And I love the way he looks, I love the way he acts, and I honestly just can't wait to see him in the anime, can't wait to see that grotesque monstrosity that is his holy form and his second form after that as well. And I think most people are in agreement that we're all looking forward to seeing Äs in the anime as one of the major Sturmiter threats with 2 fights and just overall great presence in the story. Alright guys, well that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on Äs Nödt himself. I'd like to know if you share the same appreciation for the character that I do, or if you see him as just another supporting bad guy who didn't get that much time to shine. Thanks a lot guys for watching, subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.